Alright, well this is a quick lesson on classification and division, the rhetorical mode itself. I hope you've done all your reading prior to this. Some of these things might not make sense unless you have read. So classification and division, it's a type of rhetorical mode. They're related processes that make up a single rhetorical mode. This rhetorical mode is very common. It's a way or process for organizing and sharing information. So we use division and classification almost all the time. It's probably one of the most common thought processes, and I think that's what it makes it such a difficult one to write an essay using, because it is so instinctual. We have a hard time really parsing it out. So one of the primary ways we understand the world around us is through classification and division. If we think about the foods we eat, and what we have here is actually a sort of goofy food pyramid, a silly food pyramid for us to examine, where they've taken the concept of food and classified it into groups, divided it into groups. So you can see that division here. We have caffeine, chocolate, frozen foods, and takeaway. I prefer calling it take out. So that's our groups. We've taken this big category of food and broken it into these groups. Now, this is how we do division. We break down larger concepts into smaller categories in order to help us organize and use all the data we consume each day. So if we look at the graphic below, it helps us understand for the audience of this particular division and classification, caffeine is an essential part of the audience's diet. We know this because caffeine is quite literally at the top of the pyramid. So another thing to remember is the way we classify our information and then the way we organize those groups also helps us understand what is important information, what is the most important information. So this helps us to understand a few basic concepts with classification and division. Our goal in writing a division and classification essay is to help our audience better understand something about our world. So it's not enough just to divide information and to provide people with that information. We have to also apply that. We have to find a way to make it useful and meaningful for them. And that's part of what creating our thesis does. The essay will need to contain clearly labeled categories that are supported by examples, and you can see how this uses pictures to illustrate each of the items in each category. You would use actual data, research, stories, and statistics. The way we organize the categories will be essential to helping us make an argument. So the process of division is to break one item into many parts. You now understand that. The process of classification is to group parts into mutually exclusive and parallel categories. So what do we mean by this? Well, mutually exclusive categories are categories that do not overlap. The items cannot exist in the same category. Now, we may think that that's true of this division at first when we look at it. Caffeine, chocolate, frozen food, and takeout, they seem like they're categories that are mutually exclusive and parallel. They're of the same level of importance and they're separate, but there's actually some serious problems with this division. First off, caffeine isn't a type of food, it's a chemical that exists in food, and we know that caffeine exists in chocolate. So actually, that category is non-existent. It would actually have to be a category for liquids that include caffeine to be parallel. So there we have a problem. We also have the problem that many of the foods that are being used as examples in frozen food and takeaway could be in either category depending on how they are packaged or how they are bought. So actually these are not mutually exclusive categories, and they're not even parallel categories at that. So this is not a very good division or classification. So in order to figure out a better way to organize classes or types into categories, we must develop a principle of classification. This is why that principle is so important. A classification and definition essay must have only one principle of classification, never more than one, just one. The principle of classification must be clear and purposeful. Knowing the principle of classification's purpose will help in developing a thesis statement. And now we're going to practice using movie monsters. So you can see this graphic here. It's kind of hard to see for you in the video. We're going to make it larger from time to time to go over it. And our first step in creating a classification and division essay off of this is to examine the data. So let's do that. We're going to conduct some informal research. We're going to think about it and see how it is useful. And we're going to look at how they've already divided and classified this data in many ways. And then we're going to try to determine our own principle of classification from that process. So let me zoom in a little more for you. There we go. So if you look at this chart from the Kill All Monsters website, there's the citation there, a web page citation, for those of you that didn't already know how to do that. They have divided the information based on size and color. So they have a color that's attached to a certain item. Like here we have the 50-foot woman, right? They have a color that's attached to a certain woman or to a certain item. And then underneath that color they have the size of it and the film that they're from. So like you can see over here, Mr. Stay Puft from Ghostbusters was 100 feet tall, and we can see that he is a lighter blue. So there's the image that represents him in comparison to some of these others. And the size that they're using is not weight, it's not girth, it's height, so how tall they are. So the principle of classification that already exists in this data is size, and that size is height. So now we have to figure out, well, how is this data useful? So we're going to next develop, let me shrink it down again so you can see this. We're going to next develop a principle of classification from the data. So we use size and color as a way to divide these, but we have to find the one that's useful. The only one that's useful in the first place here is size, because the rest of this information doesn't have a correspondence in the real world. These colors don't really apply to these monsters in the films in which they exist. Those are created to make the visual. So we know size is going to be the primary classification that we use, principal classification that we use for this. So now that we've done that, we're going to try to develop a satisfactory thesis. So a division and classification thesis consists of three concepts, and these need to be either clearly stated or implied: topic, categories, and principle. And this is all on page 403 of Successful College Writing. I've created a thesis here based on the data. Understanding that movie monsters can be grouped into the categories of amazingly immense, moderately massive, and relatively believable aids critics in understanding why some movie monsters are more popular than others. Now, I'm just guessing about this here. I'm hoping my research will support it. What I've really done is create a hypothesis, something that I'm going to test with my research. You notice that I didn't use list each monster and say their size. I actually grouped them into categories. I classified them. So you have these amazingly immense monsters, which in the case of this poster, you only have King Ghidorah that would be in that category. And then you have a few that are in that 200 range or close to it. And then the 100 and below would be the relatively believable monsters, at least the way I group them. Now, you could group these in many different ways and come up with many different titles for your categories. This is just one example. And this, of course, is a rough draft thesis. It's not something that is guaranteed to appear in my final paper. I would hope that I would tighten this language up a lot more. So now we have this rough draft thesis right here. We're going to use the thesis to direct our research. So I know that I'm trying to make this correlation between size and popularity of monsters. So I'm going to make this comment. I'm going to define my category. According to monster movie sizes, that's the poster's title, right? According to that, these monsters are defined as only moderately massive. We have these monsters that are 200 feet. They match the size of a reasonable skyscraper, something to compare it to give some sort of illustration to my reader who may not be looking at the poster. All of these monsters were also in wildly successful movies. So I've made this claim in a topic sentence, and now I have to go find research that supports this. So how do I define what a wildly successful movie is? Ticket sales, longevity, the fact that people are still talking about it, the fact that it's had sequels, and that's all data that I can go find through web research, through interviews, through book research even, and now I know what to look further into. So now I know what to research. So you can see how the thesis here creates a topic, and then from that topic I know now what I have to research. That's the process you need to be following here. So here, let's go back to this information. Let me shrink it down for you again so we can see the whole slide or the bulk of the slide. It is important that once we have developed our categories, we think about how we will organize the information. And then we have some possibilities. We have least to most important, most to least important, most common to least common, and least common to most common. And we have some other possibilities we can go with. But the organization is important because it helps us figure out what information is useful, most useful to our readers, are most interesting to our readers, we should say. So let's return to the monsters for a second. And how do we organize these categories of relatively believable, moderately massive, and amazingly immense? Well, right here I've created an organization. I've gone from smallest to largest. My relatively believable monsters, like the Rancor, for example, or the human, the alien queen, those are all under 100 feet. Whereas my amazingly immense monster, that's unbelievably large. It's very difficult to imagine a creature that big. So we can move it around. It doesn't have to be this way. We could go from largest to smallest. But the key question is to always ask yourself, how does my organization help me make my case? How does the organization of this information that you're providing, this division and classification, help you make a case that, well, in our discussion here, we're talking about monster movies, and we made this correlation that size equals popularity. So how does it help you make that argument? That's what you want to get to. So remember that you need to have reliable sources that give you clear examples to help you make this argument. Once you have the organization, now it's just a matter of plugging in the data that will help you best make your arguments. So the key is to remember that an example is not an opinion. We have two examples here of sorts of sentences that show up in student papers. The first one is, the Rancor is 30 feet tall according to movie monster sizes. And the second one is, according to my dad, the Rancor is the most interesting of monsters. Which of these is an example, a true example? And if you said the first sentence, you are correct because it's data. Despite the typo there, that should be lowercase. Yay, this is something you always need to look for. Self-correct on phones, self-correct on email, and PowerPoint will often cause you to make errors, and that's what happened here. This is an actual example, though, because we have this measurement and we have a source. We have a source here, but it's just somebody I know, and it's just their opinion. It's just, hey, it's an interesting monster. That doesn't really support anything. It's just saying this person, my dad, thinks they're cool, and that's not really useful. So let's summarize here. Once you have these items, a principle of classification, a thesis, some good examples, and an organization, you can start writing. And I really want to recommend to you for this rhetorical mode, many of you may have even already started writing, and what you've discovered is until you have these elements, you can't really write the essay. It's just not going to be very effective. So get these things first, and then you can write the essay. This rhetorical mode would most likely benefit from practicing creating an outline. Now, you could click here. I'm not going to do that right now. You're not going to be able to click here in the video, but you could click there and it would pull up an outline lesson from Al at Purdue. There's information in your textbooks on creating an outline. There's information in your handbooks, whichever handbook you're using, and there's tons of information online. You can do a Google search for creating an outline on Al at Purdue. It only takes a few minutes, so you can figure that out. But use an outline format to help you organize your thoughts. So I really look forward to these. I think they should be a lot of fun if you approach them in the right way. So time to start.